and to give you a future and a hope. So, in your single years and your youthful days, you must lay a foundation for the future. That's why single days are very young. Our youth time is very important. Single days are very important. You know, the first thing that people do when they want to build a house is to lay a foundation. Sometimes in India, you hear of a 3-story building suddenly developing a crack in the 3rd floor or the 4th floor, 4th-story building. And you think the problem is there. It's not there. The engineers know the problem is when they laid a foundation right at the beginning of that building, they did not lay the foundation deep enough, strong enough. And so for many years, nothing happened. And it looked as if this 3-4-story building was okay. But as the earth around it began to sink, because the foundation was not strong, the house began to sink just a wee bit. And then the crack comes in the wall. So the foundation you're laying in your younger days, in your single days, if you lay a good foundation now, it can help you throughout your life. Your life is like building a big house. Many of you may build 10 stories, houses, skyscrapers, your whole future. But you're laying the foundation now, in your single days, in your youthful days. And you read in the Bible about some young men like Joseph. You know the story of Joseph. You get time, you read it. It's in the last 14 chapters of Genesis. Genesis 37 to 50. You don't have to turn to it now. But when you get time, read it. The story of Joseph. When he was 17 years old, God began to lay a foundation in his life. And that helped him all the way till he died at the age of 110. Imagine, for nearly 100 years. That was a huge skyscraper Joseph was building with his life, but the foundation was laid when he was young. And he is one of those rare people in the Bible, particularly in the Old Testament, against whom nothing wrong is ever said. He never seemed to have done anything wrong or evil. His brothers did evil to him, but he forgave them. He's a wonderful example of a young man who laid a good foundation in his life. And he forgave. He went through a lot of trials. His 10 brothers were against him. And when he went into Egypt, sold as a slave into Egypt, imagine if you're being sold as a slave at the age of 17. You can have a lot of complaints, but he never had. And it says God was with him. Throughout those chapters, you read God was with him. When he was a slave, God was with him. That his master saw, this is an unusual slave. God is with him. And he was only about 20 years old. Imagine if you, 20 years old, 25 years old, 18 years old, that you live in such a way that older people recognize this is an unusual young man. God seems to be with him. My dear young brothers and sisters, that is my greatest longing for you. That people will recognize that God has blessed you. In the earth, they think of blessing in terms of a house and money and all that. No. The most blessed man who walked on this earth was Jesus Christ. And he never owned a house. And he had very little money. And sometimes he used to sleep out in the fields because nobody invited him in Jerusalem to their house to stay for the night. But he had no complaints. So the most blessed man who walked on this earth was not a rich man. And he was not a graduate. So the Bible says Jesus is our example. Now, it's okay. In our day, perhaps it's necessary to study and get a degree to get a job. That's okay. But the point is, In your single years, you're going to lay a foundation. Jesus, the Father, sent Jesus out into the ministry at the age of 30. What was he doing in the years up to the age of 30? At the age of 12, by the age of 12, he had really studied the Bible. That's really amazing. That means he was so eager as a young man to study the Bible every day. And remember, they never had any printed Bible like this in those days. There's one copy of the Bible in the synagogue, and Jesus must have gone there maybe from the age of 5 or 6 all the way up to the age of 12. Every day he would go and ask the rabbi, who was the preacher there, can you please read something from the Bible for me? And he would read a few verses, and Jesus would say, okay, stop. I'll just remember that. You go home, meditate on that, come back the next day to read some more of the Bible. We tell him, please read some more. Maybe he spent a half an hour like that every day. Imagine if from a very young age, you just spend half an hour every day just to understand the Bible. That's going to lay a tremendous foundation in your life for the future. So that's one wonderful example. The other example, I want to just mention 2 examples. The other example we see in the Bible is Daniel. He was another young man against whom nothing is written against him. 2 unique examples in the Bible of people who never did anything seriously wrong. And Daniel was another man who was upright and honest. He stood for the Lord in the midst of a community that was against the true God. Some of you may go to school or college or go to work, and the atmosphere around you may be exactly like Daniel's or exactly like Joseph's in Egypt. No knowledge of the true God and against the true God. And like Joseph was faithful in Egypt, Daniel was faithful in Babylon. Babylon was a very powerful nation, but Daniel was very faithful to God, even if it meant the king would get angry with him. But he says, I will not disobey God. Even in small things, he decided he will read the book of Daniel sometime and see what a wonderful man he was. And it says God gave him wisdom at a young age. And it's a wonderful thing if you can grow in wisdom from a young age. I want to show you another verse in Proverbs in chapter 22. By the way, Proverbs is a great book